I stood on my own front lawn in the thin morning light, and I watched a crew of strangers tear my dead husband's roses out of the ground. They did it with machines and gloved hands and complete indifference, snapping 30 years of careful growing like it was so much trash. And behind me, on the sidewalk, the man who had ordered it done stood with his clipboard and his coffee and told the small crowd of gathered neighbors that I was just an emotional widow who can't accept the community's rules. He was so certain he had won. He was smirking, and he had absolutely no idea that the quiet, grieving woman he was steamrolling had spent 30 years of her life writing the exact kind of rules he thought he was hiding behind. My name is Ada Brennan. That spring, I was 61 years old, 4 months a widow, and about to teach a small, cruel man the difference between having authority and understanding it. Let me tell you about the roses, because if you don't understand the roses, none of the rest of it will land the way it should. My husband's name was Tom. We were married for 34 years. Tom was an engineer by trade, a precise and patient man. And when we bought our little house on Marigold Lane, he decided that the front garden would be his life's other project. He planted his first roses the year we moved in. And every year after that, for 3 decades, he added to them, tended them, learned them, climbing roses along the fence, old English varieties by the walk, a deep red one by the door that he'd bred himself over years of stubborn trial and error, and named, with a straight face, Ada. Because, he said, it was beautiful and impossible to kill. That garden won the County Horticultural Society's award 3 separate times, but that was never the point. The point was that Tom was in it. Every single flower on that lot had passed through his hands. When he died, suddenly, in the autumn, a heart that simply stopped one afternoon while he was pruning, that garden became the last living thing he ever made. The last place on earth his hands had touched that was still, somehow, alive. I spent that whole first winter of my grief keeping it alive for him. Out there in the cold, in his old coat, doing what he'd taught me, talking to him a little. It was the only thing that got me out of bed some mornings. It was, quite literally, keeping me alive by giving me something of his to keep alive. I should tell you about the roses themselves, because Tom did not grow flowers the way most people grow flowers. He grew them the way an engineer does everything, with patience, with records, with a stubborn refusal to accept that a thing could not be done. The red one by the door, the one he named Ada, he'd bred over 11 years. 11 years! He'd cross a plant, wait a season, be disappointed, write it all down in a little notebook in his tiny engineer's handwriting, and try again. He wanted a red that held its color in the heat and didn't drop, its petals in the first hard rain. A rose, he said, that was beautiful and impossible to kill. And when he finally got it, after more than a decade, he stood in the garden and laughed out loud and called me outside and said, there she is. That's you. Took me 11 years, but I finally grew you. I have been told more romantic things, I suppose, in my life. I can't remember a single one of them. 11 years of a patient man's hands to grow a flower and name it after his wife. That was Tom. He kept those notebooks in a drawer in the garage. Every season logged, every cross recorded, decades of them. After he died, I couldn't open the drawer for months. When I finally did, I found that the last entry in his careful hand, dated the week before his heart stopped, was a note about a new climbing rose he was planning to try the following spring. He was making plans. He always thought there'd be another spring. There's a particular grief in a dead man's plans for a season he never saw. Those roses weren't decoration. They were 30 years of a man who believed in the future, planted in the ground in front of our house. And Chad Marrow decided they were a violation of community standards. And then Chad Marrow decided it was a violation. Chad was the new president of our homeowners association. Now, I want to be fair, because I spent a career being fair to people I disagreed with. Most HOAs are fine. They're a handful of tired volunteers trying to keep the gutters clean and the property values steady. But every so often, one of them attracts a very particular kind of person. A person with a small life and a large need to feel important, who discovers that a clipboard and a rule book can be made into a throne. That was Chad. He'd been elected president at a meeting almost nobody attended, on a platform of restoring standards, and he had taken to the role like a man who had waited his whole life for someone to finally have to do what he said. Chad decided that spring that my garden was overgrown and non-conforming. He'd apparently pushed through a new landscaping standard. Clean lines, low uniform shrubs. The beige aesthetic of a man who thinks beauty is a threat to order. At one of those winter meetings I had missed, because I had been standing in the snow in my dead husband's coat, keeping his roses alive. The first notice came in February. A fine. $50 for landscaping in violation of community standards. I stared at it, and I thought, surely this is a mistake. I called Chad. He was delighted to explain to me, slowly, as if I were simple, that rules were rules, and that my personal circumstances, he actually said that, my personal circumstances didn't exempt me from the standards the community had voted for. The fines escalated. 50 became 100. 100 became 200 a month. By April, Chad was talking about a lien on my house, my and Tom's house, over a rose garden. And the whole time, he wore this small, satisfied smile, because a man like Chad doesn't actually want compliance. He wants the smile. He wants the moment you realize he can make you do something. And it wasn't only me. That's the thing about the Chads of the world. They never stop at one. There was a family 2 streets over, the Portillos, a young couple with a new baby and a basketball hoop in the driveway that Chad had decided violated a recreational structures rule nobody had ever heard of. He fined them until they took it down. And I watched that father carry the hoop to the curb on trash day, with his jaw set like a man swallowing something bitter. There was old Mr. Guthrie, whose flag Chad decided was the wrong dimensions. There was a widow, younger than me, Sandra, whose fines for her non-conforming mailbox had quietly climbed past $400. Chad ran that whole neighborhood on fear and selective enforcement, and everyone paid. And everyone grumbled at their own kitchen tables, and nobody said a word out loud. Because Chad had made an example of enough people that we'd all learned the lesson he wanted us to learn. That fighting him cost more than obeying him. I know now that the fines weren't really about standards at all, but I didn't know that yet. In April, all I knew was that a small man with a clipboard was going to take Tom's roses, and that the entire street was too frightened to stop him, and that I was too tired to be the one who tried. Here is the part I'm least proud of, and the part I most need to tell you honestly, because I think a lot of you have been here. I almost let him. I was so tired. Grief is a kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones, and every ounce of fight I'd ever had felt like it had been buried in the autumn with Tom. When the fines came, my first instinct wasn't to fight. It was to comply, to make it stop, to just pay the man and let him pave over the roses and be left alone in my sadness. Fighting felt like more than I had left. I want to say that to you very plainly, because if you're in the middle of your own version of this, worn down, grieving, certain you don't have the strength, I need you to know that the strength doesn't always feel like it's there. Sometimes it's just under the exhaustion, waiting, and something has to reach down and wake it up. Grief is not what people think it is. People think it's sadness, and it is, but mostly it's tiredness, a bone-deep, endless tiredness, as if you're carrying an extra body up every flight of stairs. In the months after Tom died, the smallest things became enormous. Paying a bill was a mountain. Answering the door was a mountain. And into that state, when I could barely manage the machinery of an ordinary day, came a man with a clipboard and a stack of fines. And he had, without knowing it, chosen the perfect moment to attack. Because a grieving person will pay almost anything to make one more demand go away. That's not weakness. I want to be very clear with you, because I've since said it to a lot of people who needed to hear it. Wanting the fight to stop when you're already carrying more than a person can carry is not weakness. It's the most human thing in the world. The cruelty isn't in the grieving person who almost gives up. The cruelty is entirely in the person who saw someone drowning and decided that looked like a good time to hand them something heavy. I nearly gave up. For weeks, I nearly gave up. And I've made my peace with that, because the giving up was never the real me. It was the grief wearing my face. The real me had spent 30 years and was still in there, sleeping under all that tiredness. And thank God, something came along loud enough to wake her. For me, the thing that woke it up was the sound. Because I did object once, quietly, at the April community meeting. I stood up in that stuffy little clubhouse room in front of 40 neighbors, and I said in a shaking voice, "The garden is my late husband's. He planted it over 30 years. I'm asking for some time and some grace before anything is torn out." And Chad Marrow looked at me in front of everyone, and he sighed. A big, performed, patient sigh. And he said, "Ms. Brennan, I understand you're emotional. We're all very sorry for your loss. But we can't have one emotional widow holding the whole community hostage because she can't accept the rules. The standard's the standard. The board has already approved remediation." Remediation. That was his word for tearing out Tom's roses. And the room? My neighbors, people I'd waved to for years. The room let it happen. A few looked at their shoes. Nobody stood up, because everybody was a little afraid of Chad, and fear makes cowards of decent people in small rooms. The remediation was scheduled for the following week. And the following week, I stood on my lawn, and I watched it happen. I watched a crew tear Ada out of the ground by the door. The red one, Tom bred, because it was beautiful and impossible to kill. And I heard the specific sound of 30 years of a good man's patience being snapped and thrown into a truck. I want to tell you exactly what that morning was, because it was the worst hour of my life after the hour Tom died. And I think you should feel it, because everything I did afterward came out of it. It was early, and the light was thin and gold, the kind of light Tom loved for the garden, the kind he'd get up early to see. And a young man I'd never met put a machine to the base of the Ada rose and pulled. And 11 years of my husband's patient hands came up out of the ground in a spray of dark soil, roots and all. And he tossed it onto a pile in the back of a truck like it was nothing. Because to him, it was nothing. He didn't know it had a name. He didn't know it was me. He didn't know a dying man had spent his last recorded thought planning next spring's climbing rose. He was just a kid doing a job. And Chad stood on the sidewalk with his coffee and his clipboard and that small, satisfied smile. And he watched a widow watch her husband's heart get torn out of the ground. And he enjoyed it. That's the part I couldn't get past. He enjoyed it. I did not cry. I want you to know that. Because it matters. Something in me had gone past crying, into a place that was cold and clear and very, very awake. That sound woke something up. Because there is a thing about me that Chad Marrow never once thought to find out in all his delight at having a widow to push around. Before I retired, I spent 30 years as a municipal land use attorney. I wrote zoning law. I drafted the governing documents for planned communities, the very kind of covenants and bylaws that Chad was now waving around like a sword. I sat on the other side of 1,000 disputes, exactly like this one. I know how an HOA is actually supposed to work, down to the comma, better than almost anyone alive on Marigold Lane. And certainly better than a man whose entire legal education consisted of discovering he liked being obeyed. Grief had buried that. The sound of the roses breaking dug it back up. I went inside. I sat down at Tom's desk, and for the first time in 4 months, the fog lifted, and I became, once again, the woman I had been for 30 years, precise, patient, and very, very good at reading documents that other people hoped no one would read. Chad tried to intimidate me one more time before the meeting. He came to my door, the same door Ada had once bloomed beside, with his clipboard and a new notice, some fresh fine. And he stood on my porch and told me, with that small smile, that I was only making things harder for myself. That the lean process was already in motion. That I should let it go before it gets worse. He thought he was delivering a threat. He had no idea he was standing in front of a retired land use attorney, holding a folder that could end his entire arrangement. I looked at him, this small man on my porch, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt sorry for him. The way you feel sorry for someone about to walk off a cliff they can't see. And I said, very gently, "Chad, I'd like you to remember, later, that I gave you a chance right now to stop. I'm going to remember that you didn't take it." He blinked. He didn't understand. Men like Chad never understand the moment the ground shifts. That's what makes them men like Chad. He smiled his little smile and told me he'd see me at the meeting, and he walked back down my path. And he had no idea he'd just been warned by the one person on Marigold Lane who could actually hurt him, and had chosen, out of arrogance, not to listen. Some people you can only help by letting them meet the wall at full speed. I made 3 requests, in writing, certified, exactly as the law entitles any homeowner to do. I requested the association's complete governing documents. I requested the text of the landscaping amendment Chad had used to fine me. And I requested the official recorded minutes of every meeting for the past 2 years. Chad, still smirking, had his secretary send them all over. He thought he was humoring a confused old woman. He was handing me the rope. The documents came, and that evening, I cleared Tom's desk, and I made a pot of coffee. And I sat down with them the way I'd sat down with 1,000 cases in my working life. The professional in me was fully awake now, the part the grief had buried. And it was such a relief to feel her working again that I nearly cried. For 30 years, I had read documents like these for a living. I knew where the bodies are buried in a set of governing documents. I knew that the abuses are almost never hidden in the complicated parts, where people expect to look, but in the boring procedural parts, where everyone's eyes glaze over. The quorum requirements, the notice requirements, the ratification procedures, the plumbing of an organization. Nobody reads the plumbing. Which is exactly why that's where you hide a leak, and exactly where a professional knows to look first. I read all night. I read the way Tom used to breed roses, patiently, taking notes, refusing to be told a thing couldn't be done. And a little before dawn, in the pool of light on my dead husband's desk, I found the leak. And here is what the leak was. The landscaping amendment. The entire basis for every fine. For the lien, for the remediation that destroyed Tom's garden had been passed at that winter meeting. And our governing documents, like almost all of them, required a quorum to amend the community standards. A minimum number of homeowners present or represented for any such vote to be valid. It's the most basic protection there is. You cannot let 3 people in a room on a snowy night rewrite the rules for 200 homes. I pulled the recorded minutes of that winter meeting, the association's own official record, signed by Chad's own secretary. There was no quorum. It wasn't close. A handful of people had been there. The minutes said so, in black and white, in the association's own hand. The amendment had never been lawfully passed, which meant it did not exist. Which meant every fine Chad had levied against me was void. The lien he'd threatened was void. And the destruction of my husband's garden had been carried out under the authority of a rule that had no more legal force than something Chad had scribbled on a napkin. I sat back in Tom's chair, and I felt the old clarity settle over me, like a coat that still fit. And then, because 30 years of doing this teaches you to keep reading past, the first thing you find, I looked at the financials I'd requested, the treasurer's ledger. And I did the thing I've done 10,000 times. I followed the money. The dues didn't add up. There were payments out of the HOA's account, landscaping consulting, administrative services, community, improvement fees, to a vendor with a name I didn't recognize. It took me about 20 minutes online to establish that the vendor was a shell, and about 10 more to connect it back to Chad Marrow. He hadn't just been drunk on power. He'd been quietly draining the community's money into his own pocket and using selective, aggressive fines against people like me, partly to keep the account flush and the attention pointed elsewhere. The small man with the clipboard had handed the grieving widow his entire operation, gift-wrapped, because he could not imagine she was anything but small. The next community meeting was the fullest anyone could remember. Word travels on a street like ours. And word had traveled that Ada Brennan had asked for the documents and gone quiet in a way that made people curious. Chad opened the meeting the way he always did, with his clipboard and his standards and his little kingdom. And when the floor opened, I stood up. But I didn't stand up the way I had in April, shaking, asking for grace. I stood up the way I used to stand up in council chambers. I'd like to address the community, I said, about the landscaping amendment. And I'd like everyone to follow along because I've made copies. I began handing them around. My name is Ada Brennan. Before I retired, I was a municipal land use attorney for 30 years. I drafted governing documents like ours for a living. So I'd ask you to bear with me while I walk you through what's been happening here. I watched Chad smirk falter for the first time. It's a remarkable thing, watching a bully realize the ground has shifted. The amendment used to fine me, to threaten a lien on my home, and to authorize the destruction of my late husband's garden, I said, was never lawfully passed. Our bylaws require a quorum to amend community standards. I'm holding the association's own official minutes from the meeting where it supposedly passed. There was no quorum. It's not a close call, which means the amendment is void, which means every fine issued under it, not only against me, against several of you in this room, was unlawful. And the lien threatened against my property had no legal basis whatsoever. The room began to murmur. Neighbors who'd been fined were sitting up. Mr. Marrow, I said, either did not know that, in which case he is unfit to hold this office, or he did know it and enforced void rules anyway against a grieving widow for a garden. I let that sit. But that isn't actually the most serious thing I found. And then I picked up the ledger. I read it out loud, calmly, line by line. The way I once read documents to city councils and zoning boards, in the flat, unhurried voice that makes the truth impossible to argue with. I read out the payments, the shell vendor, the pattern. I explained in plain language everyone could follow what it means when a treasurer's ledger shows community dues flowing to a company that turns out to be controlled by the president himself. I didn't accuse. I didn't have to. I just read the man's own numbers back to a room full of the people whose money it was. And the numbers did the accusing all on their own. In March, I read, in the flat, unhurried voice I'd used in council chambers for 30 years. The association paid $4,000 to a company called Meridian Property Consulting for landscaping standards review. There is no landscaping standards review. I've asked. In April, $1,100 to the same company for administrative services. In May, $2,000 more. I looked up. I did what I used to do for a living, and I traced Meridian Property Consulting to its registration. It's a shell. It has no employees, no office, no other clients. And its sole registered agent? I paused, and the room leaned in. Shares a home address with our HOA president. Your dues, neighbors. The dues you paid on time out of fear, while he fined the widows and the young families. A good deal of that money went into a company that is, for all practical purposes, Chad Marrow's own pocket. You could have heard the roses grow. Sandra, who'd paid $400 over a mailbox, made a sound like she'd been struck. The father with the basketball hoop stood up so fast his chair fell over. And I understood, watching it land, why Chad had needed the fines to be so aggressive. Why he'd needed to keep everyone frightened and looking at their own violations instead of at the books. A man hiding a theft needs everyone else to feel guilty. It keeps their eyes down. Cruelty, for Chad, hadn't been the point. It had been the cover. By the time I finished, Chad Marrow was on his feet, red-faced, sputtering about how this was out of order, and I was an angry woman with a grudge. But the room had turned. The fear that had kept everyone quiet for a year had simply evaporated. The way fear does, the instant people realize they aren't alone, and the bully isn't bulletproof. A neighbor named Marcus, a man who'd looked at his shoes in April, stood up and said, "I'd like to call for a recall vote, right now, per the bylaws." And then the most remarkable thing happened. The thing I'll remember longer than any of the rest of it. The room stood up. Not all at once. First Marcus, then the father who'd carried his son's basketball hoop to the curb. Then Sandra, with her $400 of mailbox fines. Then old Mister. Guthrie. Then a woman I didn't even know. And then, like a held breath, finally letting go. The whole room. One neighbor after another getting to their feet. For a year, these people had sat in that stuffy clubhouse with their eyes down while Chad ran his little kingdom. And it turned out the fear had never been as solid as it looked. Fear in a room like that is a spell. And all it takes to break a spell is one person willing to say the words out loud. And then another. And then everyone realizes at the same moment that they vastly outnumber the thing they were afraid of. They always had. They just hadn't known the others felt it too. Chad stood at the front with his clipboard, and I watched him understand that the clipboard had never actually been the source of his power. We had been. Our silence had beens, and we had just stopped lending it to him. The recall vote itself took about 20 minutes, and it was, in its quiet, the most beautiful piece of democracy I have ever witnessed. One by one, per the bylaws, the same bylaws Chad had waved at us like a whip, the homeowners of Marigold Lane raised their hands to remove him. I watched Chad's face during the count. He kept starting to object, kept opening his mouth to cite some rule, some procedure, and every time he did, someone would quietly point out that the procedure was being followed exactly, to the letter, and that he, of all people, could hardly complain about the rules being enforced. He had spent a year teaching us that the rules were sacred and inescapable. And now the rules were escorting him out the door, and he couldn't say a word against them without contradicting his entire reign. There is a justice in that, so clean, it almost feels designed. When the count was done, Chad Marrow gathered his clipboard and his papers, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, apologize, or rage, or plead. He didn't. He just walked out of that clubhouse into the night. A small man who'd mistaken a title for a self, and who now had neither. I didn't feel triumphant watching him go. I felt the way you feel when a fever finally breaks. Not happy. Exactly. Just enormously, bone-deeply relieved that the sick thing was finally leaving the house. His family put their home up for sale within the month. The diverted funds became a matter for the county, and then for people with the authority to do something about it. And I understand it did not go gently for him. I did not follow the details. Once he was out of our street, he was out of my mind. That's a discipline you learn. The people who hurt you don't deserve to keep renting space in your head after they've lost the power to hurt you again. And here is the sweetest, quietest irony of the whole thing. I was the one who found the section for him, the recall provision. In the same governing documents Chad had used as a weapon, there was a clause that let the community remove a president for cause. Chad had spent a year wielding those bylaws like they were his personal property. And it was those exact bylaws, in the hands of a woman who actually understood them, that ended him. The recall passed that night, overwhelmingly. Chad Merrow was removed as president. The diverted funds became a matter for people far less gentle than me. He and his family moved off Marigold Lane before the summer was out. I understand he doesn't do HOA boards anymore. I could have taken his job. People asked me to. After that meeting, half the street wanted me to be president, to run the place with the expertise I'd hidden for so long. I said no, gently, but firmly. I didn't want a throne any more than Tom would have wanted one. What I did instead was volunteer for 1 year only to help the community rewrite its governing documents, properly this time, with real protections. Protections against exactly what had been done to me. A requirement that no one's property could be altered over a disputed violation until an independent review. A hardship and grace provision for the grieving, the sick, the elderly. Transparent finances, audited, open to any homeowner. I built into those bylaws every safeguard I'd spent 30 years wishing more communities had. Then I handed it to a decent, boring, trustworthy new board. And I stepped back, exactly as I'd planned. Sandra got her $400 back. The Portillos put their basketball hoop back up, and no one has said a word about it since. And on summer evenings, you can hear the kids playing, which is the sound a neighborhood is supposed to make. Mr. Guthrie flies whatever flag he likes. And every homeowner on Marigold Lane now gets a plain language summary of exactly where their dues go every quarter, whether they ask for it or not. Because the single best disinfectant for the Chads of this world is a set of books that anyone is allowed to read. Petty tyranny lives in the dark, in the boring parts nobody checks. I spent 30 years learning that. It turned out to be the most useful thing I knew. And then I replanted the roses. I couldn't save the ones they'd torn out. That grief is permanent. You don't get those 30 years of Tom's hands back. But the Horticultural Society, it turned out, had kept cuttings from Tom's award years, including Ada, the red one by the door. Beautiful and impossible to kill. They gave them back to me. And on a Saturday in June, the whole street came out. The same neighbors who had once looked at their shoes. And we dug together in the churned up earth. And we put Tom's roses back in the ground where his hands had first planted them. Nobody was afraid anymore. That's the thing I remember most. 40 people in my front yard, laughing, muddy, planting a dead man's roses. Unafraid. Sandra came, and the father with the basketball hoop came with his kids, and old Mr. Guthrie came and directed everyone from a lawn chair because his knees were gone, and the Portillos brought their baby. Somebody brought a cooler. Somebody brought a radio. And we put Tom's roses back in the ground where his hands had first planted them. And I showed them how to do it the way he'd taught me. How deep, how to spread the roots, how to firm the soil without crushing it. The hand does the caring, I told them, which was Walt's line from another story. But it's true of every good thing anyone has ever made. And when we planted the Ada rose, last of all, right by the door, the red one that was beautiful and impossible to kill, a hush went over the yard, because by then they all knew what it was and who it was named for. And Sandra put her muddy hand on my shoulder, and nobody said anything. It was the least alone I'd felt since the autumn. Tom used to say he grew roses because a rose is a bet on the future. You plant it for a bloom you won't see for a year. In a garden, you're trusting will still be there. I think that whole day was Tom's kind of bet. A street full of people who'd been too frightened to speak, kneeling in the dirt together, betting on a spring none of us could quite see yet. It came. The roses took. They always did. Beautiful and impossible to kill. I stood on my own front lawn and watched a small man tear my husband's garden out of the ground, so sure he'd won. While he told the neighborhood I was just an emotional widow who couldn't accept the rules. And I want to leave you with what that whole spring taught me, especially if you're the one being worn down right now. Too tired and too sad to imagine you have any fight left. The strength doesn't always announce itself. Mine was buried under 4 months of grief, and it took the sound of breaking roses to dig it back up. But it was there the whole time. It's there in you, too, under whatever's sitting on top of it. And the people who love their little authority the most are almost always the ones who understand it the least. Chad Marrow waved those bylaws around for a year like a sword. He never once read them closely enough to notice they were pointed at him. I had. I'd spent 30 years reading exactly those words. He just never thought to ask the quiet woman at the end of the street what she used to do for a living.